So, where were we? We were talking about dualisms and monisms. We've been trying to figure out the metaphysics of mind. We've been trying to figure out questions like, what are minds? What are they made of? Are they fundamentally physical things? Are they fundamentally non-physical things? That's basically the overall discussion that we've been in. And the stakes here are, of course, that if it turns out that it's something beyond physics, if the mind is something beyond physics or beyond the physical world, it doesn't look good. The prospects for doing a science of the mind look rather poor. Like, it's very unlikely that you'll be able to generate a science of the mind if it turns out to be something just completely outside of the physical world, because science studies the physical world. I don't know, maybe there's some way that you could finesse a science of the mind, even if the mind is non-physical, but the prospects look dim, right? So we're kind of hoping, if you're hoping to have a science of the mind, you're kind of hoping that it's going to be something from the right-hand column rather than the left-hand column. You'd rather it be something not a dualism, because dualism tells you that the mind is a non-physical thing, some kind of monism. Idealism would be a little bit odd for a science of the mind, but nonetheless, it could potentially be a science. Whereas most scientists assume something from the lower half of the right-hand column, some kind of physicalism. Eliminative physicalism, reductive physicalism, or non-reductive physicalism. So those are the things we've been talking about, trying to figure out where we're likely to land on that list. We ended up last time talking about non-reductive physicalisms. That is the idea that, yes, the mind is made of physical stuff, but that maybe the physical description, or at least a biological description, might not be the best way of describing the mind. So this is the idea that you have emergent properties, so properties that the overall organization of the mind has, which the parts don't have. So you don't do we started off this whole course talking about analysis, the analytic sort of strategy for understanding a physical system, which is a good strategy most of the time. If you want to understand what, how a chemical reaction works, you break it down into the individual chemicals, you understand how those chemicals operate, and then you understand the overall system. We're now exploring the idea, however, after we got through dynamical systems, the idea of complex systems, and that maybe some complex systems have overall properties that aren't reducible to the parts, in the sense that the best explanation is not at the level of the parts. Then we open up the possibility that minds are some kind of emergent property. And I'll remind you that emergence comes in at least two versions, right? You can have this version that we might call weak emergence, where the best explanation is at the level of the whole, but there's still there is still an explanation at the level of the parts. So in the weak emergence version of this picture, there is a physical atom by atom description of your entire life. So if you went from the very beginning of your life to the very end, you could tell a complete story that's just like this, and then this atom bumped into that atom, and that atom bumped into the other atom. Like, you could tell that story, and it would be a complete story. There's no gaps in it. There's no point at which that story you have to say, and then my mind reached down and moved this atom over here, or electrically charged this neuron, right? So that's the version of strong emergence. If you have to say, and then my mind reached down and caused this neuron to fire, that's strong emergence. That's the idea that there's some genuinely physically new force emerges when you have this complex whole. And that's, yeah.
Does that have any impact on the debate on free will?
So you might think you need something like that for free will. So if you're a weak emergentist, then you believe that the laws of physics completely determine your actions through and through, because there's a complete physical story. There's a complete atom for atom physical story. Some people have tried to use the idea of strong emergence to defend free will. I don't think that's a good idea personally, because strong emergence is, in my opinion, incoherent as an idea. That it's not a sense. So it's not that it's literally incoherent, it just doesn't cohere with everything that we know about physics. So there's really, really good arguments that things like mass and energy and momentum are conserved. The conservation laws say that you don't get it's just not the case that the amount of energy in a system just jumps or changes. And to have something like strong emergence, you really need a violation of those conservation laws. You really need so the amount of electrical charge in your brain at time 1 was X, and then at time 2 it's some different number, and not for any reason that you can pin on physical causes. That would be a really good, I mean, if you wanted free will in the sense of not being determined by prior physical causes, that would do it. I just think it's a super implausible account. Yeah.
Sorry, why does it imply a conservation violation? Wouldn't it just need it not to be it could just change the levels around? Decrease in one place, increase in another place for reasons inexplicable by purely atomic forces.
So you would need, if you got a switch, then you would need some breaking of the laws of energy doesn't just move around for no reason, right?
Yeah.
And that would imply a movement of energy that doesn't have a sort of causal antecedent, and that's as far as we know is a really reliable law that never happens in physical systems. Anytime there's a change of energy, there's a reason for it. Yeah. It's also free will. Just really briefly on free will, it's not clear to me that that's the kind of free will that you want, right? You don't want free will that's not a product of prior causes. You want your free actions to be caused by how you were before, right? If you as an organized whole are exerting influence over your parts, it's not obvious to me that results in you being causally connected to your past self in the right way. Yeah. Sorry, let's not get too deep in. I would absolutely spend the next 3 hours talking about free will with you, but probably you don't want to do that. Yeah. So it's a fascinating question, which I will resist going on and on and on about. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in the article, Chalmers says that consciousness is the only strong emergent property that you can think of.
Yeah.
So then it just basically sounds like dualism.
Yeah.
I don't really see the difference.
I think I agree with you. Yeah. So yeah, Chalmers is kind of a dualist. He's the source of the p-zombie argument that we saw last time, which is an argument for dualism. And yeah, so if the version of strong emergence that you're subscribed to involves just stuff happening at the microphysical level that has no previous causes, it's a little like a soul, isn't it? It's a little like a soul reaching down and causing physical things to happen, which is, I mean, you're welcome to find this however you want, but I find that quite implausible. There are other versions of emergence that I'm not going to talk about. So there's at least one person who argues for a version of emergence called fusion emergence, where the whole literally becomes more than the sum of its parts in stuff like quantum entanglement. So in quantum entanglement, two particles, you can't write down the equation for one particle separate from the other when they're entangled. So in some sense, the two particles become one object. And you can no longer describe the system at the level of its parts. If you're saying that a two-particle system is entangled, you can no longer, in the mathematics of quantum mechanics, write down the equation for any one of those particles separately. So they, in some sense, have become one. The system has become, these two things have become one thing. And they are literally not the sum of their parts. The equations for motion in quantum mechanics are nonlinear, so it's literally not the sum of its parts. Anyway, so far they've only been able to describe quantum entanglement in those senses, so maybe that's not a good one for large macroscopic systems like the brain. Anyway, so this is the kind of problematic assumption in strong emergence, that there's literally downward causation in the efficient cause sense, where your organized brain, the overall organization of your brain is pushing and pulling on your neurons, causing them to do things that they wouldn't otherwise have done. And we've talked a little bit about why that's probably implausible. There's another sense of downward causation, though, that isn't that implausible. And we talked a little bit about it with Alicia Huerero's stuff. So Huerero says, yeah, you guys are right about this efficient downward causation being silly, But here's a version of causation that you could talk about, which is formal causation, or constraints, basically. Remember that stuff about constraints, where what your overall organization does isn't like reach down and generate new causes, but it does provide a kind of organizational constraints that makes your parts do things that would otherwise be super implausible for them, right? So when we talk about convection rolls, this is a convection roll, the going round and round behavior is an incredibly improbable behavior for a particle unless it's in the system that's got the overall organization that constrains it to do that. And then it's a very plausible, very probable thing for that particle to do. So the overall system, Huarero says, is imposing constraints on the parts, which in some sense makes them what they are. And you can think about this as a kind of downward causation if you expand what you think of as causation. So instead of just thinking about efficient causes, if you're willing to admit that there are things like formal causes, then you can talk about downward causation in a way that doesn't involve violating like fundamental physical laws. So there's that. So that was this notion of emergence. And today we're going to try to think a little bit about what it could mean for explaining consciousness and qualia. Right. Any questions or concerns so far here? Okay. Okay. So today we're going to look at what's called computational functionalism, which is an idea that you've actually been exposed to quite a bit in this class. I just haven't been calling it that. So get to that in a sec. Recall Descartes' argument that matter, just as matter, doesn't seem to have anything like subjective experience. And when applied to a rock, that seems like a pretty good argument, right? Just looking at a rock, you think, well, that's probably not the kind of thing that can have conscious experience. And then the question becomes, well, what makes us different than the rock? We're made of matter, the rock's made of matter. It's intuitively obvious to most people that the rock doesn't have any kind of conscious mental dimension. So what's the difference between us and that? And maybe this stuff about emergence can help explain and understand, help us to explain and understand this. That is, maybe the overall organization of our bodies and brains is generating emergent properties that the parts don't have. So if you look at the parts of the rock, they're the same as the parts of us. They're atoms, protons, neutrons, electrons, that kind of thing, right? So you say, look, I looked really, really closely at the protons and neutrons and electrons, and I didn't see any consciousness. I don't see any consciousness at the level of atoms. So how is it possible that some system overall has this property, this apparently very mysterious property of consciousness? Well, here's a way of explaining that. Here's an attempt at responding to Descartes. Descartes' argument ran basically in this way. He said, look, the basic properties of matter have nothing like the mental dimension. They have no subjective experience, they have no aboutness, they have no meaning, and so on and so on and so on. Therefore, we have to posit some completely other kind of stuff. So to preserve the notion that we are in fact just physical beings, but nonetheless admit that Descartes' right that like neutrons and protons don't seem to have consciousness, maybe we can use this stuff about emergence to try to explain how it is that we end up with subjective experience while nonetheless being made of the exact same stuff as the rock. That's the thought. Right. So today's business is basically just going to be to look at one account of mind, one more account of the metaphysics of mind, and see how well it does on dealing with this question of qualia and reduction. And that is the view of computational functionalism. So computational functionalism, somewhere in between, there's some debate about whether it's a reductive or non-reductive physicalism. It's a type of physicalism, so it's the assumption that minds are just made up, instantiated in material things. But they've got a slightly different account of how to describe the ways in which minds adhere in bodies. So it's a functionalism, which is to say mental states are defined by their causal functional roles. That's different than the story that I told you last time about identity theory. So identity theory says your thoughts and beliefs are identical with brain states. So your thoughts and beliefs just are activities of your brain. So they are, when you say what is a thought, the answer is something like, well, it's a set of neurons doing thus and so. So that's identity theory. That's a kind of strong identification of minds and brains. Whereas functionalism wants to say that actually mental states are identified by their causal functional roles. So what they do in the brain rather than the brain itself. And that's familiar to you because this is what the GoFi people wanted to say about computations. So they are multiply realizable. The computational functionalists want to say that minds are likewise multiply realizable. They want to say, don't identify thoughts with brain states, identify thoughts with the causal functional relationships between inputs and outputs. So this is supposed to be an advance over identity theory because we're talking about something now multiply realizable rather than saying it's just brain states. It's also a kind of advance over the behaviorist picture of the mind that was prevalent at the time. So computational functionalism kind of rises around the same time as the good old-fashioned AI view. And in psychology in the mid-20th century, behaviorism was a quite prominent view of psychology. We talked a little bit about behaviorism. Just remind you that behaviorism was this idea that you don't talk about, you treat the mind as a kind of black box, they say, like a set of, like you don't think about what goes on inside the mind. The internal representations of the mind are not the business of psychology. And they had a good methodological argument for this, or at least a strong methodological argument, which was the following. We don't have any access to what's going on inside the mind. What we have access to are stimulus and response. I can measure what stimulus I give to a rat, and I can measure its response. We're going to do science. That means you have to do things that are observable. They were very much, the behaviorists were very much against people like introspectionists. So people were saying, here's how the introspectionists say, here's how you learn about the mind. You ask people about their thoughts and feelings. And then those subjective reports of your inner world should form the basis of your psychological theory. And the behaviorists having a kind of like physics envy, said, no, we need to do hard science here. The hard science is where you can just focus on what's observable. The things that are observable are just stimulus and response. So this was the basis on which a whole lot of rats lived very unfortunate lives. And we learned a lot of stuff about things like operant conditioning, which is how they design video games now. So at least we got that out of there. What it did was say, we're not going to talk about the internal states, the way in which stimulus is transformed into response. And computational functionalism is supposed to be a different view than that, saying, no, what the mind is the internal stuff, the internal functional transformations that go from taking a stimulus to turning it into a response. So they're at least going inside the mind, saying we should need to think about how the mind works in the internal sense. And the sense in which they think they're going to represent the internal workings of the mind is, of course, computation in the sense that we spent so long developing for Hausland's sense of computation. So it's a digital process, it's multiply realizable, it's medium independent, it's got sort of all of those properties of computation that we looked at. So this is the kind of metaphysical version or the metaphysical doctrine that comes along with the GoFi view, right? So this is their picture of how minds are related to bodies. And it's essentially what we talked about in the GoFi stuff, which is that minds are like the software and bodies are like the hardware, right? So a mind is instantiated in the body in exactly the same way the software is instantiated in a computer. It's multiply realizable, so it doesn't really, to understand the mind, you don't really need to understand the hardware of the computer. You just need to understand the causal functional relationships that transform inputs to outputs. That's the kind of computational functionalist view. You can be a functionalist without being a computational functionalist. So you can say the mind is a set of inputs, so the causal functional roles the mind is the kind of causal functional relationships that transform inputs to outputs without saying that those causes and functions are computational. But we'll focus on computational functionalism because we spent all that time developing the notion of computation. It's also the most prominent view in the kind of Phil mind people who are interested in AI and COG250 late 20th century. So that's what we're going to look at. So the question now is, how well does this view of the mind, of the metaphysics of mind, square with this stuff about qualia, about subjective experience? So there are some problems for getting this to work together. So we saw already some problems for computational functionalism. Searles' Chinese room argument, for example, was a problem for dealing with computational functionalism and the symbol grounding problem. So presumably you have some subjective experience of your world meaning something to you. It's got significance, it's got relevance, your symbols have meaning, and it's unclear how that would work on the computational functionalist view. Searles' Chinese room is supposed to prime your intuition to believe that, in fact, if cognition is just a matter of doing symbol manipulation on inputs, then there's no point at which, according to formal rules, then there's no point at which meaning gets into the system. It's acting like it's got a meaning, but it doesn't. This was precisely the problem of Hauslin's difficulty explaining the dual life of symbols or tokens. Remember, Hauslin says, here's his answer to the symbol grounding problem. Hauslin says, if you take care of the syntax, the semantics will take care of itself. So if you get elaborate enough rules for manipulating the symbols, then it just kind of looks like you understand what they mean, and that's enough. That's the answer to understanding the symbol grounding problem, just fancy rules. Give me enough rules, articulate enough rules, and that's the answer. And it's not a super satisfying answer. It's not a super satisfying answer precisely for the reasons that we talked about in terms of relevance stuff. So the deep problem with that as an answer is that relevance doesn't seem to be the kind of thing that you can boil down into a set of formal rules. Relevance seems to be context sensitive in a deep, deep way, and formal rules are precisely context insensitive. So it's really unclear how to make that work. And it's that thing that I just said to you that, oh, look, context sensitive, context insensitive, that's not a complete argument. What you need in addition to that thought, that line of thought, is that you've got a limited amount of time to crunch through those formal rules. So if you could build an elaborate enough set of formal rules, you could take into account all possible contexts, right? You just write a formal system that's unbelievably gigantic, and it's got a rule for every single possibility. But now what happens? Now you've hit combinatorial explosion, because that system has to be so massive that there's no way that a finite agent could keep it all in their heads. So the problem of relevance, formal rules are context insensitive, intelligence is context sensitivity, and furthermore, we have to figure out a way to get this inside the brain and body of a finite being. That makes relevance incredibly hard to deal with on the computational functionalist view. And finally, we've got the problem of qualia. So again, this has been just a kind of a review of big problems for computational functionalism. You thought there were problems for GoFi. They are, that's correct. But there are also problems for this as a metaphysical picture of how the mind works, of the sort of like the relation of mind to body being like software to hardware, where the software is computational. Finally, there's the problem of qualia, which is what we're going to deal with today. Again, some more. So we started this last time. We're just going to do more of that today. So good? Good so far? Good. Okay, so we're dealing with what's called, in philosophy at least, the explanatory gap. This is a scientist clearly explaining to us how consciousness arises from the brain. We see some neurons, and then there's some magic, and then there's consciousness. This cartoon is in some sense, it's an argument. It's not really an argument, but in some sense, it's an argument that just citing brain states isn't going to be enough to explain where consciousness comes from. So the explanatory gap is the gap between any set of facts about the brain and the conclusion that that therefore instantiates a first-person point of view consciousness that feels like something to the person experiencing it. That's the explanatory gap. The gap between, so you can easily imagine a story, I mean, not in detail, but there's no problem about imagining a story about how your brain does all this cognitive stuff that we've talked about, right? Say, if I arrange my neurons carefully enough, I can get them to do problem solving. I can get them to do categorization. I can get them to do memory. That's not like, it's a technical problem, it's a scientific problem. We know what the answer would look like. We know what the process of getting from what we know now to where we want to be kind of looks like. Whereas this thing about consciousness strikes a lot of people as we don't even know what the answer would look like. Because, as we said last time, for any story about the brain, you can always ask, okay, well, why is that conscious? Why does that feel like something? Yeah, you've explained to me how the functions work, how the causal functional relationships in the system work. Now tell me why that feels like something. Why I have a conscious experience of that. And this is for some people, this is the best we've got so far. Neurons, magic, consciousness. Some people have been tempted by things like saying it's about, it's quantum mechanics. So how does consciousness emerge in the brain? Something to do with quantum mechanics, which is sort of like saying quantum mechanics is weird, consciousness is weird, therefore they're the same thing. It's not really much of an explanation. Okay. So what I propose to do now is to look at some more thought experiments. Everybody loves thought experiments that show how computational functionalism has a particularly hard time of dealing with this. Computational functionalism, the assumptions that we make under computational functionalism is particularly stymieing for trying to deal with this explanatory gap. And then by the end, I'll try to give you some hints about where I think we can go to deal with this. Because again, if we can't deal with this, you don't get to have a science of the mind. A complete science of the mind, at least, right? Like, if that's literally your story about where consciousness comes from, you don't get a science of consciousness. You really want a science of consciousness. I propose that this is something that is not sufficient to just have stories about our inputs and outputs. We really want to understand conscious experience because that's all you get as an agent, right? So Descartes wasn't wrong that this is something that you should not let go of in your epistemology, your picture of who and what you are. All you get to work with is your conscious experience. That's all you've ever had and all you ever will have. And if what we're saying is that's forever beyond science, that's kind of disappointing for a discipline that claims to be about minds, right? All right. So let's try this. Let's talk about some things that might give us difficulty with being computational functionalists and getting an answer to the explanatory gap. We did this one already, but let's review it because it's a multi-purpose argument. This is great. So recall the Mary in the room thought experiment. Mary's a neuroscientist. She knows literally everything there is to know about how vision works. She's read every textbook, and the textbooks are way better than we have, so you can tell a whole story from beginning to end about how vision works. But she's never seen the color red. She's lived in a perfectly monochromatic world her entire life, and then one day she steps outside and sees the rainbow and goes, wow, I never knew it looked like that. But how is that possible? If she knew everything there was to know about vision, how is it possible that she learned something new by seeing the rainbow? Now, we looked at that in the context of dualism. This is supposed to be an argument for some sort of property dualism. It's also an argument, I propose, against computational functionalism, or an argument that computational functionalism can't give us a solution to the problem of qualia. Because computational functionalism says the mind is a set of manipulations of propositions. right? What your mind does is logically manipulate propositions, language-like structures, using the rules, using formal rules. And that's the kind of thing that fits real nice into a textbook, isn't it? Propositions with logical structure. That's what you find in books. Bunch of words, they have structure, it's logical, yeah? So it's really hard to see how, if her mind is just a series of propositions, it could fail to have included in the propositions the thing that she learns when she sees a color. It's particularly difficult for the computational functionalist to come up with an answer to this. Yeah? Okay. So we did that last time. Let's not linger. Let's do some novel ones. Here's another one. Shoemaker, 1982, the inverted spectrum. So we're deep into the qualia stuff now. So recall the definition of qualia. It's the kind of what it's like for me to see something. And when I learned to use words like red or green, I learned them by pointing, don't I? Somebody points to a color patch and says, that's red. And if I successfully imitate them and point at other things that they see as red, they say, you've successfully learned how to use that word. Shoemaker points out that it's entirely possible that when I'm experiencing red, what I see is what you see when you see green. So the qualitative experience of that might be flipped. Now, think about this from the perspective of computational functionalism, which is about your internal states when you're transferring inputs to outputs. The input to output thing can be identical, right? There's no difference in the way I transmute inputs to outputs. We point at the same thing, right? We have the same beliefs, that is red. But there seems to be something missing from the computational story, which is what it's like to see the red. And I believe I said for me this is a great thought experiment because it's both philosophically substantial and rediscovered by probably dozens of stoned teenagers every year on the deck of their cottage, high as a kite, and they're like, what if what I see as red is what you see as green? And they're not wrong. Like, that's a really profound question to which we deserve serious answers. Yeah, so I love this one. Philosophy has a tendency to be very esoteric, and this is one that's like sort of very accessible, right? So this is the inverted spectrum thought experiment. Yeah.
I'm just a bit confused. So when they say what I see as red is what you see as green, does that mean both people are identifying it as red? Or
That's right.
Okay, but then they're actually seeing green.
Well, so here's the question. What do you mean by actually green?
Right,
So we both point at the strawberry and we go, that's red. We agree on it. All the words that we use all match up. So everybody's identifying colors in the same way in terms of when we point to an object, what color word do we say? We would have to also have, so people have opinions about which colors go nicely together. So we'd also have to match up on which colors we think go nicely together. But if those functional relationships are all the same, you can imagine people having different inner subjective experiences of those colors. And if that's true, then there's some part of your experience that goes beyond your causal functional roles of your experiences. There's something that goes beyond, what you can articulate. So all you can say about the color of that is, I see red. You can't really go, you can maybe describe some of your feelings about it, but people have different feelings about red. So we've actually got no evidence that the inner subjective experience that I have is anything like the inner subjective experience that you have when you're experiencing the color red or the color green. There's no evidence that that's the case. All we have evidence is that when we point at an object, we say the same color. So that suggests that there is something about qualia, about the qualitative aspect of experience, that's simply not captured by the causal functional properties of having sensory experience and responding to it in various ways. If you're looking to argue against this, maybe you want to say something like this. So you can have the inverted spectrum. You can also have changing spectrums. So how is it that I can tell that my spectra isn't flipping, like across the course of a day? How could you tell that? Now, so imagine your spectrum flips at noon every day. Would you go, oh my God, all the colors changed? Probably, right? But that's a causal functional response. So that's a response that involves your things that you say, the beliefs that you're forming. And we were supposed to have all that stuff be fixed, weren't we? Right? So the thought experiment imagines that you can hold fixed all the causal functional relationships and just change the inner subjective experience. So sometimes qualia are precisely defined in terms of that stuff that doesn't play a causal functional role. But causes and functions are things like having beliefs such as, oh my God, my spectra inverted. So it's sort of weird to think that there's this property of your experience that's so central, but that you would actually have to not notice if it flipped entirely. Right? If you want to say, no, I would notice, then that's great. But what you're saying now is that it does play a causal functional role. Right? It does play the role of you saying, holy crap, my spectrum inverted. Right? So the assumption of this thought experiment seems to be that the qualia don't cause anything in terms of you saying sentences or having feelings or being surprised. In fact, you would have to, and recall the philosophical zombie thought experiment, you would have to say, if you're defining qualia as those parts of your experience that don't play a causal role, you'd have to say that they could go away entirely and you wouldn't notice. So if we're defining qualia as those parts of your experience that don't have a causal functional role, they could disappear and you wouldn't blink, because blinking is a causal functional result. Yeah? So, yeah.
Would a thought count as a function of thought?
That's right, yes, absolutely. So if any thought that you have is part of your inner, it doesn't have to be that you say it out loud, just you having the thought is part of the kind of causal functional economy of your mind. The computational functionalist would absolutely have to say that that's a causal functional difference. So what they have to say is that you couldn't even formulate the thought, oh man, my spectra just disappeared. My qualia just disappeared. And now you have to ask, what evidence do I have that these things exist? What evidence do you have that you have qualia, that you have inner subjective experience? Seriously, why do you believe that about yourself? Well, yeah.
I mean, Descartes, I think.
Descartes? Yeah, I mean, yeah. That's a good. I mean, that's the. I take it that's the answer. You got sort of like epistemic access to your own mental states, and that seems right? But what you're saying when you say that is precisely that your qualia caused you to believe that you have qualia. They must play a causal role in your mind if they are the cause of your belief that you have qualia. So, in some sense, I think that if you believe that you've got qualia, and that's a perfectly sensible belief, you can't define them as things that have no causal role. So what this does is say, your qualia have no causal role in your mind. We're going to define them as that aspect of experience that goes beyond causal roles in terms of like what it causes you to think and believe and do. But if you define it that way, you kind of define it A, out of any relevance to how you behave, and B, you defined it to be beyond your epistemic access. Because causing the belief I'm having subjective experience right now is a causal role. So that's my proposition for how it is that we're going to get out of this in some broad sense. Now, that's not to say that you can get this back with computational functionalism. So computational functionalism is probably not the right framework for thinking about how you get qualia to have a causal role in your mind. But we're going to have to come up with some answer to this, right? So it seems to me there's something that is like for me to see red. I would like for my theory of mind to tell me something about that. But that means that what I want from my theory of mind is not a kind of account of consciousness that puts it beyond having any job to do biologically. The thought that we're coming around to is that consciousness actually does something for us, that it's got a causal role, that it's not causally inert, that we need it for something. Yeah?
Does this only talk about subjective experience then, but not free will, or does this also is it only consciousness so that it also works like animals have consciousness, like they can notice if something in their vision changes.
Right.
Some people might argue they don't have free will or something. So.
Right, right. So there's a really good question about whether animals have subjective experience. And how does that relate to free will? Like,
So does this
Yeah.
talk about things regarding to free will, or is it just having a consciousness to notice things?
so typically we don't, in this literature, they don't talk about free will. They kind of think it's a separate issue. Yeah, yeah. I'd be interested if you think there's a connection here. I'd be interested to know what you.
I'm just wondering.
You just wonder. Okay, yeah. So yeah, usually they don't make the connection between free will and this. I haven't seen that connection being made. Yeah, 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 yeah.
The computational functionalists be trying to take kind of the role of how much can we strip away to establish a baseline between these qualitative experiences, or
Well, they're.
can I work away from myself until I experience things the same way?
The computational functionalists think that everything about your mind can be expressed in terms of computational operations. Everything.
But are they also looking for are they saying that there's a generalities between each of our experiences because of that?
Sorry, what do you?
So,
Try again. Yeah.
If I were to take away my senses or some faculty of my senses,
Hmm.
or let's say I can only see black and white,
Yeah.
and your ability to only see black and white, there's a generalizability of what we're going to be experiencing or seeing, like our qualitative experience of color, or I guess the world around us, will both be black and white. From their standpoint, are they trying to find that or trying to encapsulate that with a computational model, or some kind of generalizability?
I don't think they're trying to do that. I don't think that they're trying to do that. Yeah. Yeah, they're not trying to take the rich. So it sounds like what you're suggesting what they're trying to do is take the rich complexity of subjective experience and just take away everything that you can't get into a computer. Whereas they're trying to do the opposite. They think that they can express everything that there is to express about having a mind in terms of computations. That's their hope. That's their belief. Their stated position is everything that you can experience as a mental agent can be re-expressed, can be explained in terms of computational functions. Yeah, yeah. But there's another thought experiment coming up that might speak to this. So we'll hang on to that. We'll come back to it. Okay. So, all right. So this is supposed to be an argument in some sense against reducing the mind to just functions, computational functions. Reducing the mind to just, the inverted spectrum is supposed to be an argument against sort of thinking the mind can be explained physically in some sense. Again, these are kind of multi-purpose thought experiments, and you might use this one again to argue for dualism. Because if you can explain everything there is to explain about the ways that we behave physically, then they say, oh no, there's this remainder, what it's like to experience. So this phrase, what it's like, mostly finds its origins in this paper by Thomas Nagel, 1974, What It's Like to Be a Bat. This is, by the way, the cutest picture of a bat I could find on the internet. They are actually mostly remarkably cute, despite their reputation of being horrible. So Nagel says the following. Very famous paper, What It's Like to Be a Bat. Nagel says, okay, we could learn about bats. We could learn a whole lot about bats, everything there is to know in some sense. We can learn about echolocation. So you know that bats find their way at least partly by making high-pitched noises and then listening to the reflected sounds. You can know everything there is to know about that echolocation problem. But what you're never going to know is what it's like to be a bat, what it's like to experience echolocation. So this is again supposed to be, it's the same style of argument, kind of just this, almost the same argument with a different example, to try to show you that the physical facts do not tell you everything there is to know about the psychological facts, or the conscious facts. There's something that Nagel's argument is, there's something about your conscious experience that can never be boiled down to just computations. That's the claim. And I think that's right, that there's something about us that can never be boiled down to computations. But I wonder if his claim that you can never know what it's like to experience echolocation is true. So let me use the strongest form of evidence that I know, a YouTube video, to try to argue this. So there's a guy who plausibly knows what it's like to be a bat. That is, he's got a kind of sense modality that I don't know, well, actually you can kind of mildly experience this. So if you go like this, don't everybody do it at once, but make a noise like ah, you can kind of like sense your hand in front of your face. You get a bit of the sense of there being an object there. The shape of the sound changes a little, which might tell you basically that philosophers haven't sat alone going ah long enough to really appreciate the diversity of human qualia. Anyway, okay, let's take 10 minutes. Let that stew for a while, and we'll discuss implications. And feel free to go ah. Yeah. Nobody's doing it. Nobody's going ah. Try, yeah, you can do it in your home. Do it in the comfort of your home where you don't feel the judging eyes of your peers. Is there any other questions? Yeah.
I was going to ask, so the computational functionalists are arguing that there is no qualia?
No. So they're not arguing that there's no, the computational functionalists, sorry, this is a good clarification about what this debate is supposed to be about. The computational functionalists are not arguing that there's no such thing as qualia. What's happening right now is we've got the view computational functionalism on the table, and its support comes from things like the belief that the GoFi research program was going to reconstruct the mind, and hey, look, it's better than behaviorism, and it's better than introspectionism. So those are the arguments for it. And then, so there's a bunch of philosophical arguments that try to show that, hey, you computational functionalists cannot account for qualia. You can't tell me how qualia works. Therefore, because qualia are so important to our subjective experience of the world, your view, computational functionalists, can't account for this important aspect of mind. That's the kind of debate that we're in right now. Does that at least orient us in where we're at? Okay. Right, so people like Nagel say, look, you can't tell me what it's like. And I hope that at least this part of the argument strikes you as correct. That there's a difference between perspectival knowing, in the sense of like knowing what it's like to have an experience, and declarative or propositional knowing. So I can know that the CN Tower is a certain number of meters high without having a kind of experiential grasp of that. You can know that the nearest star is 4 light years away without having a sense of what it means for something to be 4 light years away. right? This is especially true when you're trying to learn about space, because like they'll tell you the numbers, and it's just you can't like process them in a perspectival way. Like you know the facts, but you don't know what that's like. Similarly, you can know the facts of echolocation. So this part at least Nagel's right about. You can know the facts of echolocation without having a perspectival understanding of it. And I would actually suggest that you can have a perspectival understanding of echolocation without knowing the facts. Presumably the bat doesn't understand sound waves reflecting. The bat just makes noises and then knows where objects are. So these two types of knowing do seem to come apart, and it does seem very difficult to reconstruct perspectival knowing, the knowing of being embedded and engaged in the world in terms of just sentences. That seems like a really deep challenge. Now, the argument that I just gave you is not a proof that you can't do it. It's just really hard to see how it would work. And nobody's done it, and they tried, and they failed. So that's a kind of empirical argument that that's a difficult thing to do. It's not a proof, an end proof. Somebody, maybe somebody's going to come up with a GoFi system that somehow encodes what it's like to have a certain type of experience. But until they do, I will remain very skeptical that that's a thing that you can do. Okay. So just on this topic of talking about qualia, there's actually really good reason to think that people have different qualia. So color qualia particularly. We know quite a lot about the visual system. It's really nice. It's extremely well studied. One of the things that's very clear is that while most people have 3 types of color receptors, some people, usually women, have 4. They have more than 3. And when there's a kind of, you can test people's ability to discriminate colors. And when you get one of these people called tetrachromats, people with 4 types of color receptors, they are way, way better at distinguishing shades of red than people like me. I think I might have just 1 or 2, because I'm not good at this. I think I was born with like 16-bit color. I hang around a lot of artists, and they're like, it's a mauve. I'm like, that's purple. I'm really bad at this, but there are people who are like super duper able to distinguish colors, which suggests to me that they're having subtler color qualia than I am capable of, right? And people report that when they do training and stuff, so if you do training as an artist, as a visual artist, you can learn to distinguish colors more carefully. You can learn the subtleties of color and therefore have different color experiences through training. And some people through biology. They're just biologically wired up to have more subtle and intricate color qualia. So I think it's interesting to note that not all people have the same qualia. Yeah?
Kind of getting back to your statement of the wired up. So I'm trying to get at the vibe. Is this a limitation to sense organs or a limitation to our brain's capacity to understand our sense organs?
In this case, it's literally the sense organ. So you got 3 types of color receptors. Most people have 3 types of color receptors in their eye. And tetrachromats literally have just another type of color receptor. So you can detect this, like you can look at their eyeballs and say, here's a structure that doesn't exist in most people.
Just be a little crazy. Like, say you got an eye transplant from one of these people.
Yeah.
Would you then be able to have the same quality?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, maybe. And we're going to look at examples shortly of the capacity to change which qualia you can have, which is amazing as well. And I think a kind of evidence that qualia have a functional role in our minds rather than being an extra that sort of like biology set you up to do all the things and then dolloped on qualia as like a cherry on top. This is a part of the structure. Yeah.
Another good example of that is people grow up learning a certain language.
Yep. Yeah.
They'll often not be able to perceive sounds in other languages that are important.
Right. Yeah. So this is the well-established fact in linguistics that you'll learn to distinguish the phonemes in your language and be unable to distinguish phonemes in other languages. So different languages slice up the sounds that you can make with your mouth differently. And if you've grown up with one set of phonemes, you just can't hear the difference between different phonemes. Like there's different, yeah. I won't embarrass myself with my lack of linguistic knowledge by giving you examples, but probably if you had experience with more than one language, you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
There's also a clicking language that really depends on the different sounds.
Right. So the click, everybody can hear the clicks.
You can hear the clicks, but sometimes it's difficult to like distinguish between words because you can't understand the depth or like
Right.
I guess how long a click is. Or
Okay, yeah. Oh, because there's differences in the clicks. Okay, yeah. So perfect example. Yeah. And it's not that you don't understand in some abstract sense what it means. Like I don't understand the words of most languages. It's that you can't perceive the difference between and people within the language can perceive the differences, and from outside of it, you can't. So this is again differences in the subjective experience given the same input. Like it's the same input that we're all getting. Okay. Okay. Back to computational functionalism. Let's do some more of this computational functionalist stuff. So, another one of these thought experiments where you're like, well, it sounds vaguely racist, but I can't put my finger on why. So, this is just a bunch of these from the 70s and 80s. All right, so this is called the, what do you call it? The Chinese nation thought experiment? It does sound vaguely racist, doesn't it? I don't remember what it's called. So here's the scenario. This is a direct attack against the computational functionalist view. So Ned Block is trying very specifically to show you that you shouldn't be a computational functionalist about mind that is leaving out something important. So imagine the following very weird scenario. You take a brain scan of somebody's brain. And I think in the original paper, you put them in extreme pain. So you electrocute them briefly or something, and then scan their brain, see what happens. Okay, so now you've got a neuron for neuron. It's a very good scan. You know exactly what's happening in every single neuron in their brain while they're having, the pain part doesn't matter, just some subjective experience. Okay, now you get all 1.5 billion people in China they've got cards that they can hold up. Now, the cards are either like, if you're holding it up, the neuron is firing. If you're not holding it up, it's not firing. And they're arranged across the country in such a way that they can see each other and respond appropriately to each other's raising or not raising the cards. And what they do is act out the brain scan. They act out using these cards, so each person is acting as a neuron. They act out the raising or not raising of these cards. Now, Ned Block says, if you believe in computational functionalism, then you have to think that what they've done is actually instantiate a mental state, like pain. That there is no difference between that weird scenario and a person actually in pain. So doing this all day would in some sense be morally wrong. In the same way that inflicting pain on somebody is morally wrong, doing this would be morally wrong. Because there is no difference between that, because for the computational functionalist, the only thing that matters is the causal functional relationships between the parts, right? Doesn't matter how they're instantiated. That's the whole thing of their view, right? The whole thing is, who cares how it's instantiated? All that matters is the causal relationships between the things, between inputs and outputs. So so we reenact the causal functional relationships. That's a genuine mental state, if anything is. Yeah.
Isn't that just saying, yes, it's multiply realizable, here's a consequence of you saying it's multiply realizable, and then just expecting people to say that's absurd because, like, it's an absurd scenario. It's like saying, haha, you can play helicopter chess. Isn't that absurd?
Therefore, chess doesn't exist.
Yeah, sure, yes, this would be immoral if you, like, yeah.
Okay. That's one, okay, so this is good. So that's one way that you can take this thought experiment. That's the fun thing about thought experiments is they're entirely constructed around just your intuitions going one way, the same way as the author's. And if they don't, then the thought experiment doesn't work on you. Block thinks that most people won't agree with you. Block thinks that, or at least he thinks that his audience will find this to be so absurd to say that this holding up of cards business is equivalent to a mental state, that they will agree that mental states are not just a matter of causal functional relationships. That's what he hopes is going to happen. Any other thoughts on this? Yep.
This also kind of gets back to like levels of processing. At every level of processing, like sure you could have something maybe multiply realized, but the causal relation between each of those things at that levels of processing will change. What they're capable of representing will change, and how they handle data will change.
Mm-hmm.
So like that doesn't necessarily go against multiple reliability or functionalism, but like this experiment, sure the people are having to communicate with each other is slower, and the way that it works is different, but like the fundamental process of being on or off or fired is the same.
So you're another person who's like, yeah, that's. So supposing the brain scan was of somebody in pain, let's change it to something nicer. Let's say they're having a great time. So they're having a wonderful experience. They've just had an epiphany, and they've just realized that everything's going to be okay. So we're saying that this is a real instance of pleasure.
I would say that like if you had to do manual computers, if you had no digital computers, if you had no cells, and you just had nothing but people, this is akin to like those computers you talked about in like the 1940s working on the atomic bomb project. You're each given a little small task of a problem, a chunk of it to do and solve, and they're working together as a whole to solve a larger problem. In this case, it's simulating a subjective experience.
But is it simulating it, or is it the genuine article? Because the computational functionalists have to say, this is as real of a subjective experience as anything that any of us has ever had.
You're talking to a person that doesn't see the difference between simulation and real. So.
Okay. You guys aren't cooperating with Ned Block. Come on. You're hurting his feelings right now. Come on. You're supposed to have very clear intuitions, and they're supposed to, no, okay, yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, so Ned Block thinks this is a devastating critique. It's terrible, terrible practice to critique the, sorry, yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
You could also think about like this. If you have like a really large three-dimensional array,
Yeah.
and you have like a bunch of blocks you can turn on and off just like this.
Yep.
If you keep randomizing it, that means you keep, eventually you'll have like minds coming and going.
Yep.
So if you
Yep.
recognize those as minds, I feel like that would be kind of absurd.
Good. So you've hit on the, so if you didn't hear that, the thought was like, you just get a big enough 3D array and just have it randomly ons and offs, then eventually you get minds. There's another line of argument against this, which is essentially the following. If you interpret, so what is a computational system? So this is, let me give you another version of that I think is the same basic thought that people have said in the literature. What is a computational system? Well, it's a system with the right causal functional relationships. Okay, but causal functional relationships are in some sense a matter of interpretation, and the world is full of causal relationships, absolutely full of them. So if with the right interpretive scheme and enough creative license, you could say that the atoms moving around in this table instantiate a computational system, which means that the table is having subjective experiences. And that seems weird, right? So a lot of atoms, quite a lot of atoms. There's enough of them such that it's likely, it becomes extremely likely that it's got some similarities to a subjective, like the things going on in our heads. That means that the table and the wall and the floor are all conscious. What?
That reminds me of something I've read. There's like this branch of biology that's interested in like theoretical organisms.
Uh-huh.
The idea was that like maybe crystals on some planets could be intelligent because the structure of the atoms in them would be interacting in such a chaotic way that after time it would give rise to minds.
Maybe.
Why not? An intelligent table, maybe.
Yeah.
I think this mostly just points out like almost the absurdity of saying where consciousness emerges from, like
Yeah.
what level of analysis it emerges from. Like maybe it comes from causal relationships, maybe it comes from the atomic structure of the brain. It's like it almost seems seems like it's impossible to tell. Like it's some Humean thing where it's like we have our experience. That's where consciousness emerges from. It's in the stuff.
That's a kind of skeptical conclusion. I think it's a fair reading. Again, with thought experiments, however you respond is just kind of how you respond, and the author hopes that you'll respond in one way. But if that's your takeaway, then I think Bloch would say, it's certainly what he really wants is just for us to give up on computational functionalism, and that's what you've done. So for him, that your response is in some sense a victory. The first victory in the room, by the way. Everybody else is like, yeah, this thing is conscious. All right. Okay, so here's another one. Here's another one from Ned Bloch. Ned Bloch loves his weird thought experiments. And this one is on blind sight. So I described this briefly before. Blind sight is this real thing. This is an actual, here's an actual phenomena. You have somebody who's got no conscious visual experience. And if you ask them, what are you seeing right now? They'll say to you, well, that's kind of I can't see anything. I told you this already. You know this about me. I can't see. And then you put a big white screen either on their left or on their right. And you say, can you tell me which side the screen is on? And they say, you're being very rude right now. I just told you that I can't see. Please, please don't be like this. And they say, well, just humor me, all right? Just tell me, just take a guess. Take a guess which side the big white screen is on. And they'll guess, and they're right well over chance. So far beyond the chance they'll be able to get it correct about which side of the screen is on. So that's the phenomenon of blind sight. So, and when you study the eyeballs of somebody with blind sight, their eyeballs are working. There's some problem deeper in the brain where the visual signal coming in through the optic nerve isn't being processed by the brain. Okay, so that's blind sight. It's a real thing. It's an actual phenomenon. It happens sometimes. And Bloch wants us to imagine super blind sight. So imagine somebody, in actual fact, they can't tell you very much about their visual system, or not visual system, but their visual experience. But you can imagine somebody who's got super blind sight, where not only, like, you have to ask them specific questions, and it's got to be about fairly simple facts. Super blind sight, they're self-cueing. They're asking themselves their own questions. And not only do they ask their own questions, but they get it right almost all the time. So they ask, do I see a bottle? And it's like, yes, I see a bottle. Or I think there's a bottle there. So somebody with super blind sight behaves exactly the same as somebody with regular sight, but they have no subjective experience of vision. Okay, so this is once again supposed to be, and you can imagine versions of this for all the other senses, right? Somebody who has no subjective experience of taste, but they can tell you what the thing tastes like. They have no subjective experience of sound, but they can tell you what sounds are coming in. You do this for all the senses, and what you end up with is somebody with no subjective experience at all, who nonetheless acts exactly like somebody who does have subjective experience. And the point of this is supposed to be that you can have all of the computational functional properties of the mind without subjective experience. Yeah?
Okay, so, but the actual experience of blind sight,
Yeah.
is this evidence, because they get it wrong more times than people who can see.
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
evidence that qualia is actually important, that you need that conscious processing?
Interesting. So I hadn't thought of it that way, but I think that's one way you could take it. I think the actual phenomenon of blind sight is just radically different. Like you have to say that they're functionally very different than somebody who's sighted as well.
Yeah.
So you can't. It's hard to pin down what the difference is because Bloch's thing is you can have all the functions without the qualia, but somebody who actually has blind sight has very different functions.
Right.
So it's only in his world of his thought experiment world that we get anything like the comparison.
Yeah, so would Bloch just be like doing, like, sure, if we accept your premise, but that's not what science actually says.
Well, you'd be sad again. You're making Ned Block very sad today. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Just a response to the question. Like,
Yeah.
I remember watching this video of a blind sight patient
Yeah.
navigating through like an obstacle course.
Yeah.
The first time ever, and the patient actually doesn't even know that there are obstacles, but he manages to avoid all of them. I think it has something to do with like they're not using the sort of like normal kind of visual areas in their brain like people do, but other areas of the brain are engaged.
Yep. So that's more impressive than I thought. I thought it was a much more limited phenomenon than that, actually. So that's a much more impressive instance of blind sight than I thought was possible. Good, thank you. Yeah.
This is a bit sneaky, the fact that, like, you had mentioned previously that our subjective experiences both depend on our inputs going into our system, but also there is something just in our heads that's kind of cooking up and doing something subjectively by itself. So if you use a lack of being able to get visual input or distinguish visual input as your basis of this is how you can't get subjective experience, you're kind of ignoring subjective experience that could just be possible in itself.
Oh, I see. So internally generated. Yeah. Well, I suppose.
Like a coma patient or a person that's paralyzed with no senses can still have a subjective experience.
But okay, so are you objecting to Bloch's argument?
Yeah.
So Bloch's argument runs the opposite way, though. Bloch's argument says you have all of the functions, you do all of the things that you would do with vision, but you don't have the subjective experience.
But tying that to eyes, I think, is the dumb part. Or tying that to like lack of visual, I guess, stimuli. Like, you need to have sense organs to have subjective experience is what I'm really objecting to here.
But that's not part of his argument. That's not a premise in his argument.
So, like, to be clear, like, the people with blind sight, they can't see. Like, am I not understanding that?
They have no experience of vision. If you ask them, what do you see right now? They say, nothing. I'm blind. Please stop asking.
Is there visual data going to their brains?
Yeah. Their eyeballs work. Their optic nerve is transmitting information to the brain. And it's in some sense being, the fact that they get it right better than chance is evidence that it is being processed by the brain somehow. It's just not making it into conscious experience.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then there was like an actual disconnection of the circuitry, I guess, that is
Well,
generating.
something's not connected in the way that it's connected in most people, but it is getting into the brain. Yeah. And you do get the opposite. Oliver Sacks has some lovely stuff about what happens in, this is actually fairly common in older people when your eyesight fails, they start having visual hallucinations. And old people, the people involved really don't want to mention it because having visual hallucinations is one of the things that is associated with like losing your mind, like you're having a mental breakdown. But actually it's just the fact that when you stop seeing things, all that visual machinery is still working in your brain. It's still churning away. So it's like, well, I'm bored. I'm just going to do some stuff. It starts generating its own images. And Oliver Sacks had this, late in his life, the famous psychologist Oliver Sacks had this experience because his vision was fading and he was starting to just see stuff. So he's got a wonderful TED. One of my favorite TED Talks is Oliver Sacks talking about his own visual hallucinations. It's lovely. Anyway, okay, so. Once again, we've got this argument that qualia are unnecessary to do the things that we do. That is, that the subjective aspect of experience is just unnecessary. Well, argument is strong. We have a thought experiment. We're asked to imagine a scenario in which the subjective experience is unnecessary to do what we do. And it's not clear to me that that's a coherent imagination, or at least it's not clear to me that having the feeling of having imagined this is equivalent to having thought through all of the parts of the actual like scenario. Anyway, all of this was meant to show, however, the following conclusion: that computations are not the kind of things that come with qualia. That just having a bunch of computations is not enough to have a qualitative aspect of experience. And if the arguments have convinced you of that, then they've done basically their job. Yeah. But then the question is, what would it mean? What is sufficient for qualitative experience? I mean, I'm in no way trying to convince you that you're not having qualitative experiences, that you don't have qualia. What I've been trying to kind of narrow us down on is, what does it have to, what properties do these qualia have to have for us to believe, A, that they exist, and B, that we can access them, right? So I've been trying to make the argument that they have to be in some sense connected to our ability to get through the world, our ability to make sense of the world, our ability to navigate the world. Those are the kind of arguments, the counter arguments that I've been offering you to each of these thought experiments have been along those lines. Like, how do you know that you're having, how would you know if your spectrum inverted? Well, that if you can tell, that means that they've got some causal role in your mind at least. Maybe not a computational role, but some causal role. What I'd like to suggest now is that to be subjective experiences, they have to mean something to us. So your subjective experience has to mean something to you. And we're going to split this up into two parts, basically. So next time on Tuesday, we're going to talk about the mean something aspect. That's the relevance stuff. So on Tuesday, we're going to talk very directly about relevance. Your qualia has to have some, they call it grippiness. It has to grip you in some way. There's nothing more characteristic to my mind of the simplest qualia like pleasure and pain other than they grip the mind. They grab your attention and they are significant to you. So one of the things that makes it, in my opinion, seem like computational functionalism can't be true is that nothing matters to a computer in some important sense. Like, computers don't have a sense of the importance of the symbols that they're manipulating, whereas their subjective experience, one of its core characteristics is that they matter to you. Today, however, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the to us part of it. So the other aspect of your qualitative experience, of your qualia, I'm going to argue, is that it's related to you as a subject. So it's related to your experience and specifically to your bodily experience. So I've kind of alluded to this a few times. Now let's talk about it directly. The embodied view of cognition. One of the potential problems with computational functionalism is that they were trying to, and GoFi in general, they were trying to model the mind without the body. They seem to think that having a body, being embodied, was just irrelevant to the mental aspects of stuff. And I said disparaging things about the people who thought this, like they were big nerds who just stayed indoors all the time. That's a kind of unfair way of characterizing it. But I do think that they were incorrect in the following sense, that having a body is not an optional extra to being a cognitive agent. And that this is the central view of people like Evan Thompson in his book Mind and Life. He is part of a group of philosophers, cognitive scientists, who argue for the enactive view of cognition, which is it's embodied and embedded, and in some sense, your experience of the world depends on how you behave in a bodily fashion. So that's the thought I'd like to develop for the rest of this lecture. Let's see quickly if I had anything else to say about that. So, and I think this is especially interesting to think about when we think about how we get, so cognition in general, like your ability to problem solve, does seem to be based on, they've got a bunch of arguments that it's based on your bodily sort of like embodiment, your bodily embodiment. I gave you a quick one before. Remember this argument about, or this empirical finding that if you have somebody sit on their hands and then ask them to give you directions, they do much, much worse at it than if you can gesture. Have you ever seen somebody talking on the phone and they're making hand gestures? Why are they doing that? It's not for the other person, right? Yeah.
Might just be a cultural thing because I've heard that some culture, like the language is not really used.
Really? I'm astonished to hear that.
Like maybe it might not be that not at all.
Yeah.
I heard that there are some that they don't use it much.
As much, yeah.
But if they were to give directions, they might only verbally say without.
Right. I mean, that's entirely possible. It's entirely possible. So the argument is not that you must gesture in order to think. And it's certainly not the case that if you make somebody not gesture, they're unable to do the task. Just that the core view here is just that the way that we're embodied and the way that we use our bodies seems to be tied up in a very intimate way with how we think. And what I'd like to make the case for you right now is that it's actually even tied up with the qualia that you experience. So let me make that argument in terms of what's called tactile visual sensory substitution. Okay, so suppose that you're visually impaired and you would nonetheless like to get around the world in the way that people who can see do. Here's one solution. You got these glasses with a built-in camera, and that camera feeds data to something that you put on your tongue. It used to be that they use a patch on the back, but it turns out using the tongue is better. And the thing on your tongue sends very small electrical signals, like little electrical zaps onto your tongue, and it's a feed from the camera. So the feed from the camera is essentially being displayed in the sense that it's little clicks from the thing on your tongue. And people who, if that's too weird, just imagine you got a camera and then you got like a patch on your back, and the patch is just poking you. The pixels that are coming in through the camera are being represented in little pokes on your back. And people can use this astonishingly as a kind of proxy for visual information. You get, and people who use this report having a quasi-visual experience. It's like they're seeing with their tongue. Okay. Now, yeah.
There was a person who went to electrotherapy session for their tongue to regain their sense of balance.
Oh, cool. Cool. What? What?
They had this condition where they couldn't walk. They felt like they were falling all the time.
Uh-huh.
They couldn't ride a bike and stuff.
Uh-huh.
So they went to, they did some therapy thing, and they would, I guess, hook like a gyroscope
Yeah.
to their tongue.
Oh.
To them,
Oh.
like their balance.
Right. So they lost like the inner ear usually gives you the signal about your balance, and that wasn't working for them. So they hooked a gyroscope up to their tongue to give them just the the tip and yaw, and that was able to retrain them. Good.
And then slowly they became able to not have to use it.
Ah, interesting. Okay, very cool. Okay, so what does this have to do with bodies? So that's kind of mind-blowing on its own, but here's the thing that relates this to embodiment. You can't just have one of these things on your tongue and watch TV with it. If you just give people a feed that's unrelated to what they're doing, they don't learn how to interpret it as a visual signal. The thing about the camera is that it's tied to your body. So when you move, the feed changes, and the feed is directly tied to your bodily movement, just like your eyeballs. And if that's true, then what your brain can do is learn to interpret that feed as visual stimulus, because it's coupled in the right way to your motor activities. So it's a sensory motor loop. When you move, the data that comes in is systematically correlated to your movement. But if it's not, if it's just channel 4 or whatever, people can't learn to interpret this as visual signals. So what's crucial to transforming little electrical signals on the tongue, like if I just put one of these in my tongue and put it on like the feed from YouTube, it would just feel like little tongue zaps. To turn it into a quasi-visual experience, the exact same stimulus into a quasi-visual experience, all you have to do is sync it up with or enter it into a sensory motor loop where Your motor activity is correlated with the information that comes in, and then your brain goes, aha, this is information about the outside world. Yeah?
Is are my eyes then correlated to like my motor physical activity? Like,
Yeah.
If this person had learned or reprogrammed their tongue eye to be able to react and see the world, would then they, after supposedly enough training, be able to watch your Channel 5 news, flopping down?
I don't know about that. I don't know about that. But maybe, yeah. It's what I know specifically about is the training process. Without the sensory motor loop, the training process doesn't work. Yeah. So like, this to my mind, this is a kind of answer to this following very weird question. Here's a weird question. Why does activity in a certain part of your brain have certain qualitative properties? Like, why is the activity in your visual center is visual qualia, activity in your auditory center is auditory qualia? There's just neurons firing. What's the difference? What's the difference? Why does one group of neurons firing produce color and another group of neurons firing produce sound? Weird, right? Kind of mysterious. Here's an answer. Your visual cortex firing creates visual qualia because it's associated with you moving your head, right? It's incorporated into a variety of sensory motor loops, right? It's associated with your eyeballs, and your eyeballs are associated with the adjustments of your head. And what your brain has learned is when I move my head, the visual information changes. When I move my eyeballs, what I get is systematically related to what my head and my eyeballs are doing. And so what your brain learns is, this is the information. What the information that I'm processing here is correlated with this kind of movement, with this activity. So it's not just that the information's coming in, it's that the information is correlated with motor activity and ways of exploring the world. So here's a way of exploring the world, moving my head back and forth. That's sampling the world for different slices of information, right? And what your brain has learned is, as I move my head, the information, the firing in this visual area changes in a systematic way that's related to what's happening in my eyeballs. And that's why it's different than what's going on. So if I plug my ears, now I'm getting an entirely different set of sensory experience than if I don't. And that's part of how your brain learns that, stuff going on in the auditory center is connected to these parts of my head. So it's the connection to various sensory motor loops, sensory motor like feedback loops that makes activity in one part of the brain visual, and it's a different sensory motor loop for, say, tactile information that makes tactile information have a different qualitative subjective experience than visual information. And if you think back to this tactile visual sensory substitution, all you have to do to get a quasi-visual experience is to hook that sensory information stream up to the motor system in the right way, and it takes on this qualitative experience of vision. So you can actually change the qualia that you're experiencing by changing the ways in which your senses are connected up to your motor activity, to your investigation and exploration of the world. So that's an argument, I propose, that the structure of your qualitative experience is at least partly or largely determined by the ways in which you're actively exploring and engaging with the world through motor activity, rather than just being a raw fact about where in the brain it goes, because this is going through a different part of your brain than your normal visual experience. But nonetheless, it takes on visual qualia because of the way it's integrated into a sensory motor loop. So if you want to understand conscious experience, you don't get to do that just in terms of what's happening in the brain. You have to know how the brain is hooked up to a body and how the body moves through the world. That's basically the argument. That's the embodied cognition view. And the inactive part is, so embodied, you have to have the body. Inactive, you have to understand how you're not only embodied, but how your body is used to move through the world and do stuff with it and to it. Yeah? Yeah.
Are you at all going to touch neuroplasticity in the brain and the emergent cells? That's kind of like what this is getting into.
Oh, absolutely. So no, it's a good notion. So again, why does activity in a certain part of the brain correspond to a certain kind of qualia? Well, you can't say that because it's in that part of the brain, because what happens if you lose your, so if you have a stroke or a lesion in your visual cortex is demolished for some reason, your brain can reorganize itself and it'll hijack some other part of your brain to process that visual information. And it will come through as visual information. So neuroplasticity, what we've learned is that the brain like if you lose a big chunk of your brain will like say, okay, auditory center, now you're doing vision too. And you will slowly but surely learn to see using the parts of your brain that used to do auditory processing. And it'll be visual qualia. It won't be auditory qualia. So the parts of your brain seem to be not completely irrelevant, but it doesn't matter that much where things are happening in the brain to determine what the qualia associated with that are. What matters is how it's hooked up to your embodied explorations of the world. The way that your body interacts with the world seems to have the most determinative influence over what it feels like to be a certain way. Think back to the echolocator, right? The echolocator is having quasi-visual experiences, having a kind of subjective experience because he's using the echolocation to get through the world. And it's going in through the ears, right? He's having a quasi-visual experience through his ears because that he's using auditory information in the way that you or I would use visual information to see things at a distance, basically. To get the shape of things from a distance is how we use visual information. He's using auditory information for that, so he takes on the qualitative experience of visual information. So this is basically the argument that your body determines your body and the way that you use the body to explore the world and gain information is what's giving qualitative experience its character. Not where it goes in the brain, not which sense organ it's coming through. You can see with your tongue if your tongue is linked up to the world in the right way, or the small of your back. Yeah.
Basically, it can't be like a brain in a jar or a computer. You need to have something to go and cause hell with.
That's right. That's right. And that's probably for my money, that's the worst thing about Ned Block's thought experiment here. Because what they haven't, so suppose you simulated all the neurons, you haven't simulated the eyeballs or the ears or the brain or not the brain, the rest of the body that would make this into a full, if Thompson's right, what you'd have to simulate is the entire body, and not just the entire body, the body embedded in an environment. Because when I'm turning my head, if there's no environment here, that's not information, right? It's the fact that there's a room here that stays stable that gives me information that's systematically correlated with how my head's moving that makes it the kind of qualia that is. So you're gonna need a lot more than 1 billion people to simulate the rest of the body and furthermore the environment. It's also my biggest criticism of the Human Brain Project. This is a €1 billion project to simulate all of the neurons in a human brain. It has failed spectacularly, and one of the reasons why I would suggest is that they're trying to simulate the brain in isolation from the body and the environment. And that's just not a thing. If everything that I've been saying here about embodiment is right, that's just not a thing that's going to work. Okay. Haven't got too much more. Let's plow on, shall we? Okay. Okay. Briefly, I want to talk about how this kind of ruins things for some pictures of cognition that are vaguely related to the computational functionalist view, to pictures of cognition that have us being like computers. So it makes it really hard to see how subjective experience could be instantiated in something that's modular. So we talked a little bit about modularity before. Modularity is just when you have a very limited number of inputs and a very limited number of outputs, right? So you're a module if you only like pay attention to very, very narrow inputs. An unmodular system, a system that's not modular, gets some kind of global picture. So saying something's a module is precisely saying it doesn't have a global picture of what's going on. Now, the psychologist Steven Pinker wrote this book called How the Mind Works. He's a kind of evolutionary psychology guy, and he defends what's called the massive modularity thesis. I think very few people actually think this. It's useful to have people like Pinker around to like say the thing that is just kind of obviously wrong. But notice that the massive modularity thesis is required by computational functionalism. So if you're a computational functionalist, you have to think that the mind breaks down into individual computational units that just take a few inputs and give you a few outputs, right? They're defined by algorithms. The evolutionary psychology people think this is true because they can't imagine how evolution could shape anything but modules. It's very hard to imagine how evolution could come up with a general problem solver. So they think the mind is basically made up of a bunch of evolved modules that are task specific. That is to say, there's a snake detecting module, or there's like a my wife is cheating on me module, or there's a like I found food module, or something like that. So there's a series of little modules that can be shaped by natural selection. Yeah.
Parallel specialist systems?
It is, yeah. So parallel specialist systems, but in the massive modularity thesis, there's nowhere where it's all brought together. So there's no global organization of this in the sense of like there's no unencapsulated. So these modules, they're called informationally encapsulated, which is to say they have no global picture. So there's a bunch of parallel specialist subsystems and nowhere that it's all brought together. Yeah. So Pinker defends this view. And Fodor, several years later, so he wrote this book, How the Mind Works. Fodor writes a book called The Mind Doesn't Work That Way, which is the kind of cheeky thing that you can do when you're famous and Jerry Fodor. He's not afraid to be a jerk, Jerry Fodor. So, and he argues that, look, we just can't be massively modular. And one of his main reasons are we're able to do things like solve the frame problem. So we're able to solve the frame problem, we're able to do relevance, and relevance seems like a global property of the world, right? What's relevant depends on your context. Things can become relevant or irrelevant depending on context, not in a way that you can pre-construct especially not in a way that evolution could pre-construct a module for, right? So things become relevant to us in ways that evolution never could have kind of already pre-specified. And the ability to do this shows Jerry Fodor, who was, recall, one of the defenders of the computational functionalist view. He was one of the main GoFi guys. And by 2001, he's convinced that, yeah, maybe a lot of our brain works in this way. Maybe we've got a bunch of modules, a bunch of specialist systems working in parallel, but there's got to be at least one part that does context-sensitive, general, non-informationally encapsulated processing. So there's got to be at least one part of the brain, Jerry Fodor argues, that's not like this module stuff. Yeah?
So they're not brought together, but are they allowed to communicate with each other?
Well, only like one or two little inputs. What they're not allowed to do is have a picture of what's going on in general. So imagine you're working in a company and you're allowed to talk to the cubicle mate on the left and the cubicle mate on the right, but you're not allowed to have a picture of what's going on in the company as a whole.
I was thinking, in respect to your company with ants, like you've got kind of your worker ant module, you've got your queen module, your defense ant, whatever, your guard module. Like they have no understanding of the colony as a whole,
I don't think that's true.
but they like work together.
So one of the ways that ants can have a picture of what's going on in the colony as a whole is pheromones.
Yeah.
So if an ant is under stress, they release stress pheromones, and the total amount of stress pheromones released is kind of like builds up in the colony.
They're not aware of all of like the entire state of all the ants.
So it doesn't have to be, so to be informationally unencapsulated, it doesn't need to be that you know everything that's going on. It's just that you're not limited to just a few tiny inputs. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And also, as far as we know, Qualia isn't conscious.
Right,
So
right,
it
right.
doesn't matter not working this way.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. Okay. So I bring this up, A, to make you aware of this hilarious clapback title of this book, which I love. Also to bring up this kind of informational encapsulation modularity thing, but also just to mention that if our subjective experience of our tongue depends on what's going on with your legs, how could it be informationally encapsulated? This seems to me, this stuff about sensory motor subjectivity seems to me a really strong argument that we're not made of a bunch of informationally encapsulated specialist subsystems. There's got to be at least some capacity to relate seemingly distant and not in ways that evolution planned for, right? So clearly evolution did not plan for you to see with your tongue. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that is not something that evolution designed us to do, right? But nonetheless, you can fairly rapidly learn to do it if you got the right sensory motor loops going on. So what that tells me is the way that you process information coming from your tongue is not informationally encapsulated, because it can talk to what's going on with your legs. So I can change my point of view just using my legs, of course. I don't have to move my head or my eyes. So that's a sensory motor loop that goes through my proprioceptive understanding of my legs. So that means that my brain's awareness of what my legs are doing is somehow related to what's going on in my tongue, which suggests to me a kind of global processing is going on here, rather than specialist processing on each. Yeah? That's the argument. Quickly, a couple more things like, here's another example of nice global processing of sensory experience. This is from Brain and Language, The Color of Odors. There's tons of fascinating studies on wine connoisseurs. And I don't want to say that they don't know a lot about wine, but you can get really interesting what's called top-down processing effects. So if you give them white wine dyed red, people will reliably describe the taste of it like it was a red wine. If you give even very skilled wine tasters, sommeliers, one glass and say, this is a $5 bottle of wine, and you give them another glass to say, this is a $500 bottle of wine, they'll taste them both, even if it's from the same bottle, and they'll go, oh, this $5 bottle is terrible, and the $500 bottle is amazing. Very reliably, very reliably. What that tells me is that there's top-down processing going on of our sensory information. That is, your expectations and your beliefs, the way that you anticipate the world will be has a very strong influence over the basic sensory experience that you have of your body. Yeah? So again, these are supposed to be examples of like the way that our experience is not, like it's really tempting to think about your sensory experience on the analogy of technology. So you've got a video recorder, it's just taking in visual information. You've got a sound recorder, a microphone, it's just taking in auditory information. And it's all put together and then processed, and then you produce beliefs. But that really doesn't seem to be the way that our experience, our subjective experience works. It seems to be deeply tied, the way that you experience the different parts of your body are deeply tied in with each other, and the way that you experience sensory information seems to be deeply influenced by your beliefs about the world, your expectations and your prior experiences. Like, again, I'm not trying to make fun of like wine people because they have a much richer experience of wine than I do. They can tell you 5 different notes in the wine, and after I've heard that, I'm like, oh yeah, I can kind of taste that. Blackberry, huh? Like they're not wrong, right? They're not. It's not that they're not having a richer sense experience, and they are because they've trained their ability to taste. So your beliefs, your experience, your training can change the way your subjective experience is structured. So all of this seems to me to be wildly unencapsulated in the sense that it's all related to everything seems to be related to everything else in constructing our sensory motor or our subjective experiences. And we got this phantom limb thing. So I did this already. So I probably don't have to get into this very deeply, but like your subjective experience of your own body can be quite unrelated to what's actually going on in your body, in the following sense that you can have a phantom limb. So if you lose a limb, you can still experience the limb. You've got a map of your body, an interior map of your body that doesn't always get updated when something changes. And I would like you to think about this. So this is the Ramachandran, V.S. Ramachandran sort of solution to this stuff. If you've got a phantom limb and you're feeling it clenched, you can't unclench it, or sometimes they're quite painful. And if there's it can stay like that for a long time. And part of the reason is that your brain is expecting for it to be a sensory motor loop. But if you've lost the arm, you can't do the motor half of that loop, right? So the way that you experience your body is a constant feedback between doing stuff and receiving feedback. If you lose the limb, you can't do the doing stuff and receiving feedback part of that. So his solution to the phantom limb syndrome is to have somebody stand in front of a mirror, got the lost limb on the left and the current limb on the right. You say move them in synchrony so that you have the visual experience of seeing your lost limb. And then you say you're moving them in synchrony and your brain is like, I can see, now I'm getting visual feedback from my moving my phantom limb. You say release your hands, release the hands. And your brain says, I can see my hand unclenching. I can see it now. I'm getting feedback. So I sent the motor command to unclench the hand. I can see it unclenching. Therefore, I can update my picture of what's going on in the hand. And when he did this, people could have A, get the hand to unclench, and B, actually sort of the phantom limb can go away. So because you're having the sensory motor loop be reestablished, you can now update the experience of the phantom limb. So again, it's the subjective experience being determined not just by the information coming in, but by the sensory motor loop of engaging in the world. Yeah.
Is this some sense like the person with phantom limb is like stuck in the halting problem where they're in like a wild loop that they can't get out of? There's like one kind of information in.
Maybe.
You gotta look at as like an exterior, the program has to like look at the entire computer and say like, okay, are we stuck in a loop?
A metaphor that only a computer scientist could grok, but yes, that sounds about right. Okay. So just to review where we've been, I've been exploring one half of this suggestion that your subjective experience should mean something to you, and today we've been doing the to you half of that. That is, your subjective experience should have some relation to your embodiment. And not only your embodiment, but the way your body engages with the environment. And that's got this profound influence on how you experience it. How your subjective experience is structured seems to have something really deep to do with that. Yeah.
The phantom thing, is it only because they can visually see it? Like, for example, if they got a prosthetic limb, and then so if someone smashed a hammer on it, they feel the pain, right? Because they like associated it.
Maybe.
Like, I saw some things like people with real limbs, they put like a plastic.
Yes.
They could feel the pain. But if
Well-
it was that they could not see the hammer, but they could hear it, would they still feel the pain?
Unclear. But so I've actually done this experiment. It's not that they actually feel the pain. It's not that they feel. Okay, so they're describing this. I did this at a talk once. So you have somebody put a hand down, and then you put a fake rubber hand down beside them, and then you put their actual hand is just beside it, behind a divider. So you can't see your actual hand. And then what you do is stroke both hands. So you've got two brushes, identical brushes, and you're stroking the rubber hand and the real hand in the same fashion, in a coordinated fashion. And people will start to, because you're seeing the rubber hand being stroked and feeling the stroking, they will very quickly identify that as their hand. They're like, that's my hand. And then what you do to freak them out is smash the rubber hand with a hammer. And they're like, that's my hand. they very in minutes they will be so identified with it that if you hit it with a hammer, they're terrified. But they don't actually feel the illusion is broken when they don't get feedback from the smashing of the hand. So they don't actually like feel the hammer hit, which is good because that would be very unpleasant for them. But this is just like you can get people to identify with by giving them the right. So I can see the stroking and I can feel the stroking. Therefore, that's my hand. You can get people to identify with things that are not them very, very quickly. So this is another nice example of having that kind of like coordination of your senses determining what you experience as your body.
But it's
Yeah.
only because it's visual. Like if
Well.
they were seeing the hammer fall down,
Yeah.
but then the vision gets like cut off when it actually hits and they can hear the sound, would they still like feel the pain of it?
I mean, I think they would still be startled and afraid. So that's the real experience is that they've identified, and you can do this without the smashing thing. It's just that this obviously I did this at a talk in Guelph, and I had a fake Halloween severed hand. Obviously not a real hand, but you can get people to identify with it very, very quickly, so that they feel like they're seeing their own hand being stroked. You don't even have to do the smashing thing. So, but once they've made that identification, then any threat to that clearly fake rubber hand is experienced as a threat to themselves. So even if you just quickly cut off their visual information, I think they would still be like, no, it's my hand. Yeah, yeah,
But like with the unclenching,
yeah.
they were able to get the relief because they could see it visually.
That's right.
So does that only mean that like the visual is the main way, or if the relief
That's a really good question, and I don't know the answer. Yeah. It strikes me that it should be anything where you can get anything where you can get the sensory motor feedback loop going should work, but I can't back that up with like any kind of study. So that's a really interesting question. Yeah. Yeah.
Could this be in any way like conceptually related to how we pack bond with things that logically can't feel pain? We're just like, no, don't smash the Roomba.
Maybe. Yeah. Yeah, and how you like. Yeah, so maybe. I think that's if I had to guess what that is, I think it's our tendency to over attribute agency in the world. We talked about this earlier. We have a cognitive bias to over attribute agency because if you think there's an agent but there's not, that's fine. But if you don't realize there's an agent, they can like eat you and your family. So we get really attached to things really quickly. My favorite example is from Community, where somebody goes, if I say this chalk's name is Jeff, and you're like, no, Jeff. yeah, you feel a little bit sad for it. All I did was give it a name. I think that's we're very eager to attribute agency to things. But notice that you can identify with your phone, because your phone is part of your sensory motor loops. If you lose your phone, that feels a lot like losing a part of your body, doesn't it? That's like, oh, part of my brain is gone. It's a very panic-inducing feeling. Happened to be the other day, I left my phone in the bathroom after the last class, and I'm like, ah! Yeah, and it's like losing part of your body because it's part of your, like, how I do actions and then it gives me information, so it's part of my sensory motor loop. Yeah.
This seems like almost like computational belief updating. So you have like a heuristic that has one goal that's going towards something. It doesn't know whether or not it's really that great. So then it kind of jumps around, gathers some more information, and then goes back to its goal with that information, then tries to solve it in a more efficient way, or tries to update its current belief or strategy for the environment. When the person has their arms stuck in their phantom limb loop, they're getting more information in like another arm, and then they're kind of updating their beliefs, and then their brain's then doing, okay, things are good now. We can continue. Is that what's going on? Is it dynamic belief updating?
So so you would think that the sensory experience of not having an arm would be perfectly sufficient to update to, I don't have an arm, I can't possibly be in pain or clenched. You would think that. If it was if the system is you take in information and then process it and then build a map and then do stuff. So if there's a clear separation between information coming in and processing and then doing stuff, then you would expect that the phantom limb would never happen, because you're like, I'm not getting any hand information, must not have a hand anymore. And that's kind of what you would expect if there's this nice mind-body separation. So if there's body information that then gets transferred to the mind for processing. But what we see is that the mind-body connection is too, like, because they are super integrated, you can't even update your body's map of your hand without the motor activity. So you need the motor loop to even do the updating.
So, kind of getting up to like the belief update. So as you're doing the computation, what I kind of mean is like as you're going through the steps, you're taking in more data that also affects that computation itself.
Mm-hmm.
Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Well, that the acting and the computing are not separate. That's the claim. That there's the act of being a body in the world doesn't seem to be separable from the experience of having a body. If those two were separate, then you'd expect nobody would have phantom limbs. You would expect that people wouldn't be able to learn to see with their tongues. Like none of this stuff that I've been describing the last couple hours, like last hour or so, would make any sense if the mind and the body were genuinely separate entities. What the conclusion is supposed to be, or at least these are supposed to be rough arguments for, that you need sensory experience is with respect to me. That's it. Okay, but that's not the complete story I propose about qualia and sensory experience. The other half is that it's supposed to mean something. So the grippiness, the compellingness of your sensory experience. It's why people get mad when you make the argument that maybe they don't have it. It's like, no, it grips me, it means something to me. So the mean something is going to be our target. Next time we start talking about relevance, finally, directly, rather than like bouncing off of it and alluding to it, we'll at last talk specifically and pointedly about relevance as it relates to sensory motor experience. Okay, that's it for this time. Thanks, everyone.